The story begins on a chilly autumn evening at a bustling McDonald's restaurant in a suburban neighborhood. The night shift manager, a young woman in her early 20s who had worked her way up from crew member over 3 years, was going through her usual closing routine. The restaurant's bright lights cast long shadows across the empty dining room as she wiped down counters and checked inventory. Through the large windows, she couldn't help but notice a group of teenagers huddled together in the far corner of the parking lot. Night after night, their numbers seemed to grow. They weren't causing any trouble, just sitting there, sharing what looked like half-eaten sandwiches and trying to stay warm. Some wore thin jackets despite the dropping temperatures, while others wrapped themselves in blankets they carried in their backpacks. The manager's heart grew heavy as she watched them. She had always been troubled by the restaurant's policy of throwing away perfectly good food at closing time. Each night, dozens of burgers, chicken sandwiches, and boxes of fries, all fresh and barely past their hold times, would end up in the waste bin. The company's strict policies meant that even food made minutes before closing had to be discarded. One particularly cold night, she noticed a new face among the teens. A young girl who couldn't have been more than 15. The girl was shivering, wearing only a light sweater. The manager watched as the other teens shared their blankets with her, creating a tight circle to share body warmth. That was the moment something inside her shifted. She couldn't stand by and watch anymore, not when she was throwing away enough food to feed them all. She began to think about how she could help without breaking too many rules. The manager knew the corporate policies inside and out, having memorized the handbook during her training. She also knew the exact times when the security cameras made their scanning rotations and which areas of the kitchen weren't fully visible to the monitoring system. That night, after her staff had left, she made a decision that would change multiple lives, including her own. Instead of tossing the leftover food into the waste bin, she carefully packed several unsold burgers and fries into clean bags. Her hands trembled slightly as she added some untouched apple pies that would otherwise go to waste. Everything was still warm and perfectly safe to eat. Food that had been prepared for customers but never sold. The manager's heart pounded as she carried the bags out through the back door. She had always been a rule follower, someone who took pride in doing things by the book. But sometimes she realized doing the right thing meant looking beyond the rulebook. As she approached the group, she could see the surprise and uncertainty in their eyes. They were used to being shooed away from businesses, not welcomed. "I have some extra food that's going to waste," she said softly, holding out the bags. It seems wrong to throw it away when people are hungry. The teens hesitated at first, but the aroma of warm food quickly overcame their caution. As they began to eat, their initial wariness melted away, replaced by genuine gratitude and relief. What started as a one-time act of kindness turned into a nightly routine. The manager became more strategic about it, carefully marking certain items as waste in the inventory system while actually setting them aside. She made sure to vary the types of food she saved, ensuring the teens got some variety in their meals. More importantly, she began to learn their stories, not by prying, but by listening when they chose to share. Some had left homes where they didn't feel safe. Others had been forced out when their families discovered who they really were. A few were simply caught in the crushing gears of poverty, their families living in cars or shelters that couldn't accommodate everyone. Regardless of their circumstances, they all shared a common thread. They were kids who had grown up too fast, forced to navigate adult challenges while still in their teens. The manager knew she was taking a risk, but seeing the difference a simple meal made in these young lives made it worthwhile. The teens began to look healthier, more alert. They started helping each other with homework under the parking lot lights, sharing tips about safe places to sleep and wash up. A small community was forming, built on trust and mutual support, all starting with a few bags of food that would have otherwise gone to waste. Over the next few weeks, the night manager developed a careful system for helping the homeless teens. She started keeping track of which menu items usually had leftovers at closing time. Chicken sandwiches from the dinner rush, fries made just before closing, and apple pies that hadn't sold. She noted it all in a small notebook she kept in her pocket. She got creative with the inventory system, learning exactly how much food she could save without raising red flags. Sometimes she'd mark items as dropped during preparation or log them as cooking errors. Other times, she'd slightly adjust the waste counts. Nothing major, just enough to help feed hungry kids who had nowhere else to turn. The teens, grateful for her kindness, became unofficial guardians of the restaurant. They made sure no one caused trouble in the parking lot and even picked up trash they found around the property. Some of them would wait until she finished her closing duties, then help her take out the recycling or sweep the parking lot. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about creating a safe space where they felt valued. Word spread quietly among the local homeless youth community. The group grew from 5 or 6 regulars to about 10, sometimes 12 on colder nights. The manager made sure to learn each face, to understand who was truly in need versus who might be taking advantage. She noticed how the regular teens would explain the unspoken rules to newcomers. Be respectful, stay quiet, help keep the area clean, and never cause problems that could jeopardize the arrangement. One teen brought his younger sister one night, apologizing for not coming alone, but explaining that he couldn't leave her by herself. The manager watched as the group immediately welcomed the girl, sharing their blankets and making space in their circle. That night, she made sure to include some extra cookies in the food bags, the kind that always brought smiles to young faces. The manager began keeping a few extra supplies in her car: clean blankets, warm socks, and basic toiletries. She'd distribute these items occasionally, careful not to make it too obvious. When one teen mentioned trying to attend school despite being homeless, she started including notebooks and pens in her supplies. It wasn't much, but it was something to help them hold onto their dreams of a better future. The teens shared bits of their stories during these late-night food distributions. One had been sleeping in the local library during the day and wandering at night. Another spent hours riding buses back and forth across town, trying to stay warm and safe. A couple of them had part-time jobs but couldn't afford both food and a place to stay. They weren't just statistics anymore. They were real young people trying their best to survive in impossible situations. Some nights, when the weather was particularly harsh, the manager would let them stay in the lobby a bit longer before closing. She'd make fresh coffee and let them warm up, pretending to be busy with cleaning so they wouldn't feel rushed. During these moments, she'd overhear them talking about their dreams: finishing school, finding stable jobs, having a place to call home someday. The teens looked out for each other like family. If someone didn't show up for a few days, the others would go looking to make sure they were okay. When one teen found a spot at a youth shelter, they made sure another who needed it more took their place in the nightly food distribution. They shared information about free clinics, job openings, and safe places to spend the day. What started as a simple act of preventing food waste had grown into something much more meaningful. The manager saw how this small bit of reliability, knowing they would have at least one meal each day, gave them the strength to keep pushing forward. Some started making plans to get their GED. Others began saving what little money they could earn from odd jobs. They were beginning to believe in possibilities again, all because someone had chosen to see them as human beings worthy of care and respect. But as the group grew and the system became more established, the manager couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched more closely. New cameras had been installed recently, and she noticed more surprise visits from upper management during her shifts. She knew she was walking a dangerous line between compassion and company policy, but looking at the faces of the teens she helped each night, she couldn't bring herself to stop. Little did she know, her secret mission of kindness was about to be discovered. As winter settled in, the bond between the night manager and the homeless teens grew stronger. The nightly food distributions had become more than just a handout. They were a lifeline of hope and human connection. The teens started opening up more, sharing their struggles and small victories with someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. One of the older teens, who had become a natural leader in the group, helped organize their small community. He made sure everyone got their fair share and kept track of who needed extra help. When a new teen would join them, clearly scared and unsure, he would take them under his wing, explaining how things worked and making them feel welcome. The manager noticed how he always made sure the younger ones ate first, often saving barely enough for himself. The teens started looking out for the restaurant too. They'd warn away troublemakers who might cause problems, and even helped stop an attempted break-in one night by calling the police when they spotted suspicious activity. They felt a sense of ownership and responsibility for the place that had become their sanctuary. Some of them would quietly pick up trash around the property during the day, wanting to give something back in return for the kindness they'd received. The regular group had their own subtle ways of communicating. A particular way of knocking on the back door, a specific time they knew to gather, quiet signals to warn each other if anyone official-looking was around. They became experts at being invisible when needed and looking like regular customers when someone important might be watching. Trust grew slowly but steadily. The teens began sharing more about their daily challenges, how hard it was to keep clean, to do homework without a proper place to study, to hide their situation from teachers and classmates. Some had jobs but couldn't keep them because they had nowhere to shower regularly or wash their uniforms. Others were trying to finish school while sleeping in parks or abandoned buildings. The manager started bringing in extra supplies based on what she learned about their needs. When one teen mentioned trying to write a school essay on his phone because he had no computer, she started letting him use the restaurant's office computer during quiet periods. When another talked about missing school because his shoes had fallen apart, she organized a quiet collection among her trusted staff members to buy him a new pair. Their conversations during these late-night meetings became deeper and more meaningful. The teens shared their dreams. One wanted to become a nurse, another hoped to open his own business someday. They talked about their fears too, of never escaping homelessness, of losing hope, of being forgotten by society. The manager listened, offered encouragement, and reminded them that their current situation didn't define their worth or their future. The dynamic of the group was fascinating to watch. They had created their own little support system, complete with unwritten rules and responsibilities. The older teens mentored the younger ones, helping them navigate the challenges of street life while encouraging them to stay in school if they could. They shared information about safe places to sleep, which shelters had open beds, which libraries were good for staying warm during the day. Some of the teens started making progress in their lives, small steps forward that filled everyone with hope. One got accepted into a youth housing program. Another found a steady job at a local warehouse. Each success was celebrated by the whole group, proving that change was possible. The manager noticed how these victories inspired the others, giving them the courage to keep trying despite their circumstances. But with each passing week, the risk of discovery grew larger. More employees were starting to notice the regular gathering of teens in the parking lot. Questions were being asked about inventory discrepancies, no matter how small. The manager began to sense increased scrutiny from her supervisors, more frequent checks of the security cameras, more surprise visits during closing time. Still, she couldn't bring herself to stop. She had seen too much good come from these simple acts of kindness. She had watched too many young lives begin to turn around, too many small sparks of hope ignite into flames of determination. The risk to her job seemed a small price to pay compared to the difference she was making in these young lives. But as pressure mounted and suspicions grew, she knew it was only a matter of time before everything would change. The moment of discovery came on a quiet Tuesday night. A new assistant manager had been transferred from another location, someone who didn't understand the delicate balance that had been created at this restaurant. He stayed late that night, supposedly to learn the closing procedures, but his real purpose became clear when he watched the night manager's every move with suspicious eyes. The night manager tried to go about her usual routine, her heart beating faster than usual. She could feel his eyes following her as she cleaned the kitchen, counted the register, and prepared for closing. The homeless teens were already gathering in their usual spot. She could see them through the windows, waiting patiently in the cold, unaware that everything was about to change. She tried to be extra careful that night, marking everything properly in the system, but she couldn't bring herself to throw away the perfectly good food that had been made just before closing. As she carefully packed leftover burgers and fries into clean bags, she heard footsteps behind her. The assistant manager stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching her with a mix of triumph and disapproval. "So this is where our inventory discrepancies have been coming from," he said, pulling out his phone to document everything. "Corporate's been wondering about this location's waste numbers for months. Now we know why." His voice was cold, professional, detached from the human reality of the situation. The night manager tried to explain. She told him about the teens, their struggles, how they helped protect the restaurant, how much of a difference a simple meal could make. She showed him how she carefully tracked everything, how she made sure food safety was never compromised. But she could see in his eyes that none of it mattered. Rules were rules, and he was determined to enforce them. "This is theft," he stated flatly, taking pictures of the packed food. "Corporate policy is clear about disposal of unsold items. You're giving away company property and creating liability issues. What if someone got sick? What if we got sued?" He was already typing an email on his phone, presumably to corporate headquarters. Through the windows, she could see the teens watching, sensing that something was wrong. The older ones were already moving away, their survival instincts kicking in, while the younger ones looked confused and worried. She wanted to at least let them know what was happening, to say goodbye properly, but the assistant manager wouldn't leave her side. He made her dump all the packed food into the waste bins, watching to make sure every piece was destroyed. She had to fight back tears as she threw away what would have been dinner for hungry kids, knowing they were watching. The worst part was seeing their faces through the window, the look of betrayal, of yet another adult letting them down. The next hour was a blur of phone calls and documentation. The assistant manager called the district supervisor, who quickly arrived to assess the situation. They went through security footage, examining weeks of closing shifts, noting every instance of unauthorized food distribution. They pulled up inventory reports, highlighting every small discrepancy, building their case methodically. The night manager sat in the office, watching as they dismantled months of careful work, of trust built and lives touched. She tried to explain the human side of the situation, how these weren't just random people looking for handouts, but kids who had nowhere else to turn. She talked about their progress, their dreams, how the small bit of help was making a real difference. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. By midnight, the teens had all disappeared from the parking lot, melting away into the darkness like they'd never been there at all. The district supervisor had finished his investigation, his face grim as he closed his laptop. The assistant manager stood by, looking pleased with himself for uncovering what he saw as a serious violation of company policy. "This is a liability nightmare," the supervisor said, shaking his head. "We'll need to schedule a formal meeting with HR tomorrow morning. For now, I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending investigation." He held out his hand for her name badge and restaurant keys, which she slowly unpinned and handed over. As she gathered her personal belongings from the office, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen to the teens now. Where would they get their next meal? Who would look out for them? The weight of these questions felt heavier than the loss of her job. She knew she had broken the rules, but in her heart, she also knew she had done the right thing. The next morning, the night manager found herself sitting in a sterile corporate office, facing 3 stern-faced executives across a polished conference table. The room felt cold and impersonal, with charts and graphs on the walls showing profits and losses, no space for human stories or compassion. The meeting began with a detailed presentation of evidence against her. Security footage played on a large screen, showing her carefully packing food night after night. They had spreadsheets documenting every inventory discrepancy, every marked down item, every missing burger and order of fries. What she saw as acts of kindness they saw as a pattern of theft. Do you understand the seriousness of your actions? The regional manager asked, sliding a thick folder of documentation across the table. You've cost the company thousands and lost inventory. More importantly, you've exposed us to massive liability risks. What if someone had gotten sick? What if we'd been sued? The night manager took a deep breath and decided to speak from her heart. She described the teens she'd helped, not as statistics or liabilities, but as real people with names and stories. She talked about the young girl trying to finish high school while living in a car, the boy who worked 2 jobs but still couldn't afford both food and shelter, the siblings who'd fled an abusive home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I know I broke the rules, she admitted, her voice steady despite her nervousness. But these kids were hungry, and we were throwing away perfectly good food. They weren't just random people. They became part of our community. They protected the restaurant, kept the parking lot clean, warned away troublemakers. They just needed a chance, a little bit of help to keep going. The executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. One shuffled papers nervously, another checked his phone. They weren't used to hearing about the human cost of their policies. The night manager continued, pulling out her small notebook where she tracked every item she'd given away, showing how careful she'd been about food safety and inventory management. I made sure everything was still fresh and properly handled, she explained. I kept records of what I gave away. These kids, they're not trying to take advantage. They're just trying to survive. And we were throwing away enough food each night to feed them all. But corporate policies had no room for compassion. The HR director cleared her throat and pulled out termination papers, already filled out and ready for signatures. While we understand your intentions were good, she began in a rehearsed tone, we cannot overlook such serious violations of company policy. The night manager looked at the termination papers, then back at the executives. Before you make your final decision, she said quietly, I want you to know something. Those kids you're so worried about suing us, they spend every night protecting your property. They stopped a break-in last month. They kept other homeless people from causing trouble. They did all this not because we paid them, but because someone finally showed them some basic human dignity. Her words hung in the air, but she could see they'd already made their decision. The regional manager started his prepared speech about company liability and policy violations. The HR director pushed the termination papers closer. The third executive wouldn't even meet her eyes. As she signed the papers, she thought about the teens who would be waiting in the parking lot tonight, finding nothing but darkness and locked doors. She thought about the progress some of them had been making, the ones who'd started talking about going back to school, the ones who'd begun to believe they deserved better. You know, she said, standing up after signing the papers, your policy about liability and food waste. It's not just about money. It's about what kind of world we want to live in. Those kids taught me more about community and looking out for each other than any corporate training ever did. She gathered her belongings, including the small notebook filled with her careful tracking of every meal she'd given away. As she reached the door, she turned back one last time. I lost my job today, but I didn't lose my humanity. I hope someday your policies can find room for both profit and compassion. With that, she walked out of the office, holding her head high. She had broken their rules, but she had followed her conscience. And somehow, that felt like the real victory. News of the night manager's firing spread quickly through the local community. It started with a simple social media post from one of her former coworkers, sharing how she had been fired for feeding homeless teens. Within hours, the story had taken on a life of its own, touching hearts and sparking outrage across the city. Local news stations picked up the story, with reporters gathering outside the McDonald's asking questions about corporate policies and food waste. Regular customers began sharing their own observations. How they'd noticed the parking lot was always cleaner than other locations, how they'd seen the group of teens helping to pick up trash, how the restaurant had felt safer with them around. A small protest formed outside the restaurant the next day. People held signs questioning why good food was being thrown away while people went hungry. Some longtime customers shared stories about the night manager's kindness, not just to the homeless teens, but to everyone who came through those doors. The protest wasn't angry or violent. It was peaceful but determined, asking simple questions about corporate responsibility and human compassion. The local homeless youth shelter reached out to news stations to explain the bigger picture. They talked about how many young people in their community had nowhere to go, how many went hungry each night. The shelter director spoke about how the night manager had done more than just feed the teens. She had given them hope, shown them that someone cared about their well-being. Former employees started speaking up too. They shared stories about how much food was typically thrown away each night, not just at this location, but at fast food restaurants everywhere. They talked about how the night manager had created a system that was safe and careful, how she had kept records of everything she gave away, how she had made sure food safety was never compromised. The story caught fire on social media. People began sharing their own experiences with corporate waste policies, not just from fast food restaurants, but from grocery stores, bakeries, and cafes. Questions were raised about why companies would rather throw away good food than give it to people in need. The hashtag RightThingWrongRule started trending locally. Local business owners started reaching out to homeless advocacy groups, wanting to know how they could help safely and legally donate excess food. The city council announced they would review local ordinances about food donation and waste management. A local law firm offered to help draft guidelines for businesses wanting to implement food donation programs. The homeless teens themselves, though scattered now, found ways to share their stories through the youth shelter. They talked about how having one reliable meal each day had helped them focus on improving their lives. Some had been able to stay in school, others had found jobs. They spoke about how the night manager had treated them with dignity, had seen them as people worth helping, not problems to be solved. Community members started organizing. A local restaurant owner offered the night manager a job, saying he wanted someone with both business sense and a strong moral compass. Others began gathering supplies for the homeless teens: food, clothing, school supplies. The youth shelter reported an increase in donations and volunteers. Religious leaders from different faiths spoke up about the moral implications of waste in a community where people go hungry. They challenged other businesses to examine their policies about food waste and donation. Some offered their facilities as safe spaces for youth during the day, places where they could study or rest without fear. Even some former critics began to change their minds as they learned more about the situation. A business professor from the local college wrote an opinion piece about how modern corporate policies often prioritize liability concerns over community welfare, suggesting ways this could be balanced better. Insurance professionals offered insights about how businesses could donate food safely while managing legal risks. The conversation grew beyond just this one incident, touching on bigger questions about community responsibility and corporate citizenship. People began asking why profitable companies couldn't find ways to help their communities while still protecting their business interests. The story became a catalyst for change, pushing people to think differently about waste, hunger, and the power of individual actions to make a difference. Throughout all this attention, the night manager stayed humble. When interviewed, she always brought the focus back to the teens and the larger issues of youth homelessness and food insecurity. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She just wanted to spark real change in how communities handle food waste and care for their most vulnerable members. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of the night manager's actions continued to create positive change throughout the community. The local restaurant that hired her became a model for ethical food management. They implemented a formal program for donating unused food to shelters and youth organizations, all done legally and safely with proper documentation and handling procedures. The former night manager helped design this new program, using her experience to create guidelines that both protected businesses and helped those in need. She worked closely with food safety experts and lawyers to ensure everything was done properly. Other restaurants in the area started following their example, reaching out for advice on starting their own donation programs. The homeless teens who had once gathered in the McDonald's parking lot found new support through this growing network of caring businesses and community members. The youth shelter expanded its services, aided by increased donations and volunteer support. Some of the teens who had been regulars at the late-night food distributions became peer mentors, helping other young people navigate their way to stability. One of the most inspiring developments came from the local business community. Several small business owners got together to create a youth employment program specifically designed for homeless teens. They offered flexible schedules, understanding that these young employees faced unique challenges. Some businesses even partnered with the youth shelter to provide job training and life skills workshops. The city council followed through on their promise to review food waste policies. They passed new guidelines, making it easier for businesses to donate unused food while protecting them from liability issues. They also created a task force to address youth homelessness, bringing together business leaders, social workers, and young people who had experienced homelessness themselves. The story reached national news outlets, inspiring similar conversations in other cities. Other communities began examining their own policies about food waste and corporate responsibility. The night manager was invited to speak at conferences and community meetings, sharing her experience and helping others understand how small acts of kindness could lead to big changes. Some of the teens from the original group made remarkable progress. One graduated high school and received a scholarship to community college. Another completed a job training program and secured full-time employment. Each success story proved that sometimes people just need a chance and a little help to turn their lives around. The McDonald's franchise faced continued pressure from the community. Eventually, they announced changes to their food waste policies, partnering with local food banks to donate unused food when possible. While they never publicly acknowledged the night manager's actions, their policy changes spoke volumes about the impact one person's courage could have on a large corporation. Local schools began including lessons about food waste and community responsibility in their curricula. Students learned about food insecurity in their own community and organized food drives and awareness campaigns. The conversation shifted from viewing hunger as someone else's problem to seeing it as a community issue that everyone could help address. The youth shelter reported a significant increase in community support. More people volunteered, donated, and most importantly, paid attention to the issue of youth homelessness. They expanded their services to include educational support, mental health counseling, and job placement assistance. The shelter became a model for other communities looking to better serve their homeless youth population. Through it all, the former night manager remained focused on the real issue, helping young people in need. She used her unexpected platform to advocate for better support systems for homeless youth. Her simple acts of kindness had sparked a movement that continued to grow and evolve, proving that one person's compassion could inspire an entire community to change. As winter approached again, the community had transformed. Instead of one person secretly helping hungry teens, there was now a network of support, working together openly and legally to make sure no young person had to go hungry. The night manager's choice to do the right thing, despite the personal cost, had created a ripple effect that continued to touch lives and inspire change, showing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness.